Well, thank you for joining us today for our study of Daniel chapter 10 with our FBI class, the Fulton Bible Institute. My name is Matthew Thigpen from the Fulton Church of Christ, and appreciate you tuning in and watching us this morning. We are watching the video, or I hope you've watched the video, as we're about to answer the questions from that class. Before we get to their questions, a few announcements to make. As we announced on our Facebook page and on our text message group, we are going to suspend our classes for now. We're going to, as a matter of fact, for the rest of Daniel, we're going to do it all virtually. So that means this week we'll do chapter 10, next week 11, the week after that will be the 12, Daniel chapter 12, and we'll be through. Hopefully in the fall, when we start back at the end of August, all this will be passed and we'll be back to meeting regular time. Now, what that means is that we're going to be doing it on YouTube every Tuesday. We're going to put a video and put the response on the YouTube for you to have. Now, let me make a suggestion to you as you watch this video on YouTube. Down at the bottom of the YouTube video is a subscribe button. You can click that subscribe button and you'll get all the videos we put out from the Fulton Church of Christ. We'll put out some devotionals in our Sunday morning service as well. But for the FBI videos, you'll be able to see those, and also there's a little bell icon underneath it as well. That is a notification icon. We encourage you to click that notification icon so that every time we post, you'll be able to be notified that we're doing that. And this is one of the ways we're reaching out to our community, reaching out to our churches to try to help out and try to offset some things as people are getting in this quarantine and trying to figure out what's going on. So our FBI is one thing. We also have our services as well. So I encourage you, if you can, to do that. I know you'll greatly benefit from that, and you'll enjoy these videos. But that's all the announcement type I have. Let's get into our questions. As we said today, we begin the last three chapters of Daniel. The last three chapters of Daniel are very interesting because they all tie together. Because chapter 10 introduces this angelic messenger to Daniel, and he interacts with Daniel. And then chapter 11, we hear his message to Daniel. And then chapter 12, we hear the conclusion of that message. So chapters 9 through 12 are just one continuous story. And chapter 11 is a very interesting chapter. He's going to divide it over two lessons that we'll get to in the next few weeks that are going to tell us about that great thing. But before we get to that great vision, we get to Daniel 9. We're introduced to this angelic visitor, this celestial visitor, as he calls him in the book, who comes to Daniel. And so that leads us into our questions this morning. The first question is concerning Daniel's vision in chapter 10. What is the date of the vision? The date of this vision is 537 or 536 BC, depending on when in Darius' first year this occurs. Now, again, the interesting thing to think about here and to remember about this is that he's going to talk about the coming of the Greek Empire that doesn't occur until 300 BC. So we're looking way in the future, but here he is telling him what's going to happen hundreds of years beforehand. And then on that, we see the next part is that Daniel has been fasting and mourning for how long? He has been fasting and mourning, as we're told, for 3 weeks. He's been praying to God about what's going to happen, praying to God about what is going to occur. And if you go back to Daniel chapter 10, you'll look in the first few verses. It tells us this. In chapter 2, what's interesting about this is that you look at what Daniel says in verse 2 and 3. Is that Daniel, or verse 2 through 4, Daniel says he had not eaten, he had not done delicacies, he'd had no meat or wine, he did not put perfumes on for full 3 weeks. Then number 4, the interesting thing, on the 24th day of the first month, I was standing on the bank of the great river. Now, let's stop there. This is what's interesting, is Daniel is fasting during the first month. What's interesting about this is that first month in the typical Jewish calendar, that is the month in which the Passover and the Feast of the Unleavened Bread and all those and some of those feasts occur. It is typically a month that is described as being a feasting time. For the Jews, this was a time not that they would fast, but when they would feast and they would celebrate what God had done for them. But here Daniel is, again, interesting to our situation, in a unique situation, and that there ought to be a time of feasting, a time of celebrating, but Daniel's fasting. Daniel is fasting because of Israel. And he's fasting because Israel has went home. Again, this is the third year of Darius. Israel has returned to Jerusalem. And most people think that what happens is they get there and they begin working on the temple, but they stop. you know your Bible history, you know the Jews start building the temple, they lay the foundation out, and then they stop. Then they start building their own houses. It's not until Ezra and Nehemiah come in the scene later that they encourage them, and the prophets encourage them, rebuild the temple. Don't rebuild your houses first. You should build God's house first. And so they had to be spurred on. And so some people think that maybe this is the background for Daniel. Maybe Daniel has received word that Israel's home, but Israel's not doing the work God's called them to do. And therefore, they have to be encouraged. And so therefore, Daniel is down and Daniel's out. And Daniel is fasting and praying to God. And it's in that we get to question 2, where Daniel gets a vision. A figure comes to Daniel by the river. And the question number 2 is give 2 other scriptures where the figure in Daniel's vision is described. And those 2 passages are Ezekiel chapter 1, verses 26 through 28, and then Revelation chapter 1, verses 13 through 16. And there, in both of those passages, we see this description of a figure like Daniel's. Now, again, I will say one thing from my personal standpoint. I don't know if I'm as firm a believer as the teacher is that this is Jesus himself. The description is similar, yes. Does that mean it's the same one? No, this could just be the way the angelic bodies look. We don't know. But the description is similar, and this has led some people to say, as the teacher says, that this description is Jesus. However, we really don't know that for sure. And so I want to take a step back from what he says, and you know we've done this before with our classes. Take a step back and say that this is a possibility who this is. I'm not as 100% sure as he is that this is the Messiah. And we'll talk about why that would be in just a minute because of what's going to happen and later on in this chapter. And we'll talk about that in just a few minutes, so the next questions. Notice number 3. Number 3 is what is the connection between chapter 9 and chapter 10? He'll tell us in chapter 9 is the announcement that the Messiah is the announcement of Messiah. There's the announcement of the Messiah that he is here, and that's what he says. And this is the Messiah who's here before his physical flesh. And then chapter 10 is this revelation of the Messiah. Chapter 9 last week talked about the announcement of the Messiah's coming. Chapter 10 reveals the Messiah is there. Again, it depends on how you interpret Daniel 9 and 10 is how you view this, or Daniel 10 I should say, if you view this being as being the Messiah. But as far as our questions go, that's what 9 is. 9 is announcing the Messiah, and 10 is the Messiah appearing. Chapter 4, number 4, says what is the mission, or the mission of the celestial being involves what 2 messages for Daniel. Number 1 is a message of comfort or assurance, and then number 2 is a message of revelation. A message of revealing what is coming. And so this is what the angel does. The angel comes, or this celestial being comes to Daniel, and in verse 10 through 12, he gives Daniel comfort. He touches Daniel. He encourages Daniel. He tells Daniel to know that his prayers have been heard. And here's one of the things that makes me think this may not have been the Messiah, is because he tells Daniel that God heard his prayer the first day, but it's taken him 3 weeks to get to him. It's taken him 3 weeks to get to Daniel because he's been hindered by the king of Persia, prince of Persia. We'll talk about that in just a minute. But he says he's been hindered. To me, he says he's been hindered in such a way that Michael has to step in and has to assist to deal with the prince of Persia, while this messenger is able to go on to Daniel. To me, if this is the Messiah in some kind of pre-incarnate form, why would he be hindered by another angel? Why would he be hindered, even if it's a messenger of Satan, why would he be hindered for 3 weeks to be hindered to Daniel? I just don't believe that. I think this is probably an angel in another form. This is an angel that is, again, that name, angel, a messenger of God, that's coming to Daniel. I do not believe this is the Messiah. But what happens is that he mentions Daniel, or mentions Michael. He says that he struggled with the king of Persia for 21 days or 3 weeks, and Michael steps in. And Michael comes in. That goes to the question number 5. Who is Michael, and what is his relationship with Israel? Michael is the archangel, or the prince, or chief, or ruler of angels. He is a chief of angels. He's a commander of the angels. And so he steps in, and he takes on this conflict. The idea is you have this conflict of this messenger and the prince of Persia going at war. And the prince of Persia has this messenger tied up for 3 weeks where he can't get past him. And what happens is that Michael comes in and takes his place. Michael steps in, and this Prince of Persia focuses on Michael rather than the messenger, and therefore the messenger is allowed to escape and allowed to get to Daniel. That's the vision I have of this, and that leads us into the next part of who is Michael. He's as chief angel, but he's also described as being your angel, talking to the Jews and talking to Daniel. And so most people think that he is an angel assigned to protect the Israelites. Michael is also described in Jude 9 as having fought Satan over the body of Moses. And so we have this idea of Michael being this head angel or chief angel who is the angel over Israel, who fights to get Israel to overcome and to follow where God would have them to be. And as he does mention, I will say this, that what we see in this passage is a rolling back of the curtain to see what happens on the other side. As he mentions, the wars and the things that happen in this world is not just what we see, but there's another spiritual side of this where you have the messengers of Satan fighting the messengers of God. Those angels are demons of Satan, and that leads us into our next question of who is the Prince of Persia in this context, and that is he is a spiritual being, either an angel of Satan, a demon, whatever he may be. He is something of Satan who is fighting, and again, he's working on Satan's behalf, and he's fighting to prevent God's plans from coming. He's hindering God's will. And so this is what you see. And again, this is the references he talked about in Ephesians and talked about, I believe it's Philippians. Ephesians and Philippians, he mentions those two verses. But Ephesians 6:12, more power, that we wrestle against the powers and the authorities, those spiritual beings. And so this is the idea that there's another side happening, is the spiritual beings versus the Satan's spiritual beings versus God's spiritual beings. And there's this struggle to try to figure out who's going to come out on top. And so this is what happens. So the angel finally says, I was able to get to you, Daniel. I'm finally able to come to you after 3 weeks of trying. I finally get here. And I've come to tell you this vision. I've come to tell you about what is coming in the future. And that leads us into number 7, to Daniel's response to the explanation of the vision, the explanation of what this being is here for, what he's trying to accomplish, and that is that Daniel faints. As Daniel has done before. Daniel's been 3 weeks without food, so Daniel's probably weak anyway. And being in the presence of this heavenly being just hits Daniel even harder. And so Daniel is overwhelmed, and he is fainted. And then the second part is, after he faints, it says the angel again touches him, and the angel strengthens him. And the angel comforts him and tells him, this is what's coming to happen. He's coming to tell Daniel about the fate of the Jews. What's going to happen to the Jews and the Greeks and the Persians. He's going to tell him what the future holds. And again, he's going to tell him not in explicit detail, but he's going to tell him by prophecy. And what's interesting about this prophecy is the way some of these prophecies are laid out. They're very interesting in how they're fulfilled in the real world. And we'll talk more about that next week as we get into Daniel 11. And then so what we see here, the last part of this is the last question. According to verses 20 and 21, what was the purpose for the coming of the celestial being? And that was that Daniel would write it down, that Daniel would write this down, that later some could come and believe. Again, he wrote this down so others may believe. Write this down so others can hear it. They can hear this message and they can believe it. They can see what Daniel said 300 years beforehand. Then when they hear it and they see it come to be, they can realize that Daniel had a word of truth, that Daniel had a prophecy that bypasses anything man has done. You know, you look at people of our world who try to predict the future and try to say different things that have happened. Of all those things that have happened, of all those people who say they have these abilities, no one is able to predict with the accuracy that Daniel does. And this is what leads people to say that, Daniel wasn't a real book, that Daniel wasn't really written in 500 BC before the events happened in 300, that Daniel was actually written in 100 BC. It was written right before the time of Christ because Daniel couldn't have known those things. And you're right, Daniel as a man could not have known. I cannot sit here this morning in my office and tell you, hey, in 200 years, China's going to be in charge, and on top of that, there's going to be a little group you've never heard of. A little bitty group, a little bitty nation is going to come to power, and they're going to rule the world. I can't do that. I could do that, but that don't mean it's going to come true. I could do that, but it's my guess. I've got as good a guess as anybody else could have. But Daniel didn't guess. Daniel prophesied. Daniel said, this is going to happen with this, 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 and this. And we're going to see next week and the week after, all those things Daniel said would happen, happened. And Daniel predicted with a prophecy that is unlike anything else in the Bible of how detailed it is, but yet still people doubted him. And so this leads us with the last question, the one we just answered. Why did he have to write this down? So that others can believe. That's what we should get from Daniel chapter 9 and verse 10, Daniel 10 and verse 10, 11, and 12. Is that God is a God who predicted events 200 years in the future. He said this is going to happen. If that God knew what was going to happen then, that God knows what's going to happen now. And he knows what's going to happen tomorrow. He knows what the future holds. And that is a God that we can trust in. That is a God we ought to trust in. That is a God we ought to listen to obey, and follow in all that we do. I thank you again for your time. I thank you again for your attention. I encourage you one last time. On the bottom of this video, you'll see subscribe to the Fulton Church of Christ. I encourage you to subscribe to it so you'll know when we post something. You'll be able to see us in your feed of YouTube, but also hit that bell notification, that bell icon, so you'll be notified when we post a new video. As I said, we'll post new videos every Tuesday for the next 3 weeks. For FBI class, we'll post on Wednesday a devotional we do every week. And then finally on Sunday morning, we'll post our Sunday morning worship here. We'll do a live stream on YouTube as well as on Facebook, and we'll be posted in both places. Again, I thank you for your attention. I thank you for being here. I thank you for your patience. I know this is a difficult time for everyone, this social distancing. Hopefully this is a temporary setback. Hopefully things will get back to normal as soon as possible. And again, we look forward to seeing you in person as soon as we can. But until then, I hope God blesses you, and I hope you have a God-blessed day.